Welcome back to A Bite from the Money Sandwich, where we provide practical and easy to understand tips and ideas on how to manage your money better so as to let you retire with comfort and on your own terms. Want more practical, easy to understand tips and action lists to help with your money matters? Buy my book, The Money Sandwich. Available now on our website, themoneysandwich.com, as well as major online retailers. The purpose of this podcast is to provide tips and ideas to help solve your money and retirement problems. Today's topic is all about property investment. Have you ever wondered what guidelines you should follow for when buying a property? Maybe you personally don't want to invest in property, but have millennial children which you want to help them get into the property market. Today, I'm joined by David Hancock, who is the director of Binnari Property. Binnari is a property investment advisory company which David and his team use an in-depth research process to assist Australians to make the right decisions before buying an investment property. David's background was as a strategic financial advisor and so understands not just the property side, but also the planning and tax side as such a major and emotional purchase. Importantly, I should add that any of the topics raised here today is general information only and not advice, and should not be acted upon without getting advice, as simply we don't understand your personal circumstances or goals and how it could affect your situation. Now, everyone is interested in property, and whether it's to buy your own home or an investment. So it's great you can be here today to provide your expert views. So welcome, David.
Yeah, thanks, Marc. Thanks for having me.
Now, on the property section of my book, The Money Sandwich, I provide some helpful hints when buying a property. And so this could be a great place to start. And the first one is all about location, location, location. And what I mean by that is if you're buying in a suburb you grew up in, and we've had this conversation before, you know the good areas, the good streets, the bad streets, but a lot of people can't afford now, especially in Sydney and Melbourne, in buying in their own suburbs, so they have to look elsewhere. How do you help your clients with that same type of feel for what you see in your own suburb?
Yeah, Marc, it's a great question, and it's actually a challenge that we see a lot with investors. They tend to know their local area really well. As you say, they know where they want to live. They know the great streets. They know where the transport is and things like that. But when they tend to buy outside that area, or particularly interstate, they can get a little bit sort of wrapped up in some of the larger macro factors like the infrastructure spend and things like that, but they fail to really understand, just through their lack of understanding of the area, where some of the challenges are in that particular area. So really what you're looking for is you want to be buying in local areas that have got a high proportion of owner occupiers. So that's people that are effectively buying the home to live in for themselves. There are in most of the sort of key cities and regional towns around the country, there are always going to be some pockets where there's a high proportion of investors. Unfortunately, if you get the wrong location, you buy in one of these investor type areas, you can sort of have substandard performance. So it's really kind of key that you basically buy like a local, and you kind of take advantage of and look for areas that have got all the key infrastructure, schools, restaurants, transport, parks and things like that. So having that local knowledge, where we come in is we travel a lot extensively, and we obviously not at the moment with COVID, but we travel a lot, and we basically help our purchasers buy as if they're a local.
Okay, and so apart from, there may be a Westfield in the area or something like that you part of your analytics, I suppose you're also looking at what the next 5 years may be. If there's a train system or train track coming near that area or something that's going to help boost that suburb.
Yeah, you are. I mean, you're looking for, fundamentally you should be putting yourself in the shoes of a local buyer and thinking, look, what are some of the key things that they're looking for? Where are they working? Where are they shopping? Where are their kids going to school? All these types of things. So it's really crucial that, certainly these things like a new Westfield can have a really positive outcome. One thing I would say is it's also important, though, in some of the sort of newly established areas, you do understand the potential for future property supply, because even though the area can have a lot of great infrastructure, if it's got a lot of future property supply and it's not being bought by the local market, it's being sold to investors, that can be a potential pitfall. So again, it is very much understanding the location you're buying into and the type of demographic that's going to be purchasing those properties.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. One of always the main advantages I've always found of property is that you can borrow. You can borrow for shares as well, but most people feel more comfortable with borrowing when it comes to property. And the simple reason is that if it was a $500,000 property, although that's not really Sydney or Melbourne anymore, but if it was a $500,000 property, if you had to save, it'd probably take you 10 years to save that much, whereas you can borrow now with a small amount of deposit. That must be a lot of, your clients, you see that's the main advantage to help them get into the property market.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, borrowing can go both ways, Marc, as you know, as an expert in finance, but generally speaking, one of the key advantages of property over other assets is the ability to borrow money and secure a much larger investment. And, provided you've bought the right investment and held it for long enough, you're getting growth on the total investment, not just your initial deposit. And that sort of borrowing or gearing, as people say, is one of the key advantages to property. I mean, we do get people sort of come to us looking for properties that are what they call negatively geared, where effectively that's where the expenses of the property are more than the income. So when you add up all the expenses and all the rental income, if there's a negative balance there, that's effectively tax deductible or tax deduction, and people are chasing negatively geared properties. I mean, we personally, with interest rates being so low, we see a lot of our clients at the moment that are actually being able to secure really great properties for capital growth, but they're fundamentally either breaking even or what we call positively geared, where they're actually getting surplus income. And for us, we think that's a great thing, because we'd rather have income than be paying expenses. So at the moment there's a unique thing going on with record low interest rates, but certainly that borrowing aspect does turbocharge your investment returns when it comes to property.
Yeah, and as you've now touched on negative gearing, I think that's a really good point, because when I first started, 30 odd years ago, the main people who were talking about buying investment properties and negative gearing were people in very high tax brackets or very high salaries. And so they wanted that tax relief. And so anything they could negatively gear to get a tax deduction was, the main aim or main goal. Whereas this whole low interest rates has just opened up investment property buying. And we'll talk about millennials later, but it's opened up to a whole new level of people or range of people, so that it's not the tax deduction they're after. They're just wanting really good income producing properties, or the rental income, to help pay off the loan, so that they're getting assets growing in the background while they're still working. Yeah,
I mean, so Marc, for example, we are seeing a lot of first-time purchasers coming through at the moment who predominantly coming out of, say, Melbourne and Sydney, they're feeling priced out of those local markets because the median price point of the areas they're living in are just unachievable. They may not have the deposit, or they may not have the borrowing capacity to buy into the area that they're currently living in, but they don't want to necessarily move outside of those areas. So their preference is to either stay at home or to rent, and they're buying in areas that they can afford. We call them rent investors, and there are a lot of millennials in that. And what we're seeing with these guys, even though they may not be higher rate taxpayers, a lot of them are still finding that, even with borrowing 90%, that the income they're generating is actually covering, the borrowing, the interest cost, but also all their associated running costs. Now, we focus on newer style properties, so the running costs are generally quite efficient, but we're seeing that they're able to basically afford to run these properties and quite often have a little bit of money left over. And then when they get their tax deductions on top, they're actually sort of significantly cash flow positive. So, and that's down to interest rates being at record lows. Obviously, if we were at 5 or 6%, we'd probably see that swing back a bit, where they would be negatively geared. but with tax deductions on top, they'd probably be breaking even. So look, it's the sort of going back to what you said, Mark, it just depends on where interest rates are at on to where they sit on that curve. But certainly there is an opportunity at the moment for people to secure investment properties, and they'd be quite efficient from a cash flow perspective.
Yeah, and that's the sort of the point I really want to make about millennials, because a lot of my clients are the ones who are the sandwich generation in their 50s and 60s, and definitely while their main goal may be to comfortably retire, what their second public goal is how do they help their millennial children get into the property market or get that head start to life. And so I just find it fascinating, this interesting phenomena where a lot of millennials themselves say, yes, they may want to live in a city, but they know they can't afford there. And it's a great term. I've not heard that before, rent vestors. But they realize, yes, this is where my lifestyle is, but I still want an asset growing in the background. And it may be in 5 years' time, I may be working in London. It's not as if you've got a career. It's a very different mindset to having that career for here. I'm going to be working here in Sydney for the next 40 years. So having the lifestyle they want, but also having investment properties in the background, working hard for them makes sense. And I definitely know it's something that the people in their 50s and 60s are saying, well, how can they potentially help their children into the property market, even though they know they're priced out of the suburb they may have grown up in?
Yeah, I mean, we see it all the time, and you mentioned, and it's generally a certain age bracket that's kind of in their sort of potentially early to mid 20s to late 20s, or even early 30s, to mid 30s. So you haven't actually secured a property, and one of the things that they can often come in a little bit disheartened, especially if they're at the sort of latter end of that age range. But by trying to take the emotion out of it and helping them to take some action, quite often they can utilize this first purchase being an investment to one day secure maybe a house in a location, be it Sydney or Melbourne or somewhere that. So it's a springboard, if you like, to generating some growth that might then fund a deposit for a Sydney purchase, for instance. So we see that a lot. But also, you mentioned traveling overseas. We also see people who may have the ability to buy, but for whatever reason they don't actually want to commit to a large home at the moment, home purchase, because they don't want to carry that type of investment debt in the future if they want to go overseas. So there's a flexibility factor here that comes into play. They may want to go overseas from work overseas in an area like sort of London or New York, or they actually may work in defence. They may be based in a certain location, but they don't plan to live there long term. They may not actually. We had a client the other day. He said to us, "Look, I don't have a life partner yet, so I don't even know if I want to be based in Sydney. So I actually don't want to sort of tackle buying a home yet until I know who my long-term partner is going to be and where we want to live." So they haven't actually answered those questions yet, but what they do know is they want to get on the ladder with and purchase a property from a building wealth perspective. They just don't have some of those other questions answered in their life yet.
And of course, also having that second property for people who do have their own homes, who are in their 50s and 60s and saying, well, I can see retirement in the future. I am trying to build assets that could provide future income. So yeah, you've raised a couple of points about taking the emotion out of that. I think having experts being able to help you, guide you, and make sure you don't overcommit it, say things like an auction, and setting limits on that. So how do you help people who are saying, well, okay, how do I know how much I can borrow? Do you help guide people on working out the actual assessment mathematically of it's going to be positively geared, it's going to be negatively geared, or this is what the loan's going to be on 500,000, so that when they go to the bank, they can be fully prepared?
Yeah, look, it's a great question because, coming from, as you know, Marc, I have a background in sort of strategic financial planning, and coming from that, I genuinely believe people are always sort of best if they have some form of strategy to their decision making. And I think that understanding your borrowing capacity for one is key before you do embark on a property purchase, because there's just there are certain things that could pop up that might unpack that, and people can get themselves into trouble. So one of the first questions we ask people is, look, what's your strategy? What are you trying to achieve through this purchase? The other thing, we have a lot of relationships with mortgage brokers and obviously dealings with banks over the years. So we really like to understand their situation, just to know that they're not going to put themselves in harm by, for instance, they might be buying an investment property today with a view to buying a home in 2 or 3 years' time, but maybe that investment property has an impact on their borrowing capacity for that home. So just understanding and educating them is key, because we don't want people to make the wrong decision when it comes to property. But also, as a firm that deals with completed properties, but also off the plan purchases, understanding their potential future situation is key. So, if they're purchasing a property off the plan, maybe today their borrowing capacity is really strong and there's no problems, but their plans to start a family. So understanding how that might impact their future borrowing capacity is really crucial. So yeah, we do. I mean, it's, we're not here to sell property to someone. We're here to help them, advise them and guide them on utilizing property as part of a strategy. And that really is fundamental to start with things like their objectives, but also what is their borrowing going to look like. So yeah, it's fundamental that we get that right. And you mentioned the cash flow side of it. Again, coming from the planning background, we like to kind of map out what their potential affordability of that property might look like, if they're, when they're buying it. But also we like to stress test that with, higher interest rates and, a lower rental income, etc., just to make sure that they're not buying a property, especially in today's market where some of the conditions are perfect for property buying. In certain markets where you've got really high rental incomes, take say areas like say Brisbane, you've got a really strong rental income, we've got record low interest rates, it's a perfect storm. But that might not always exist. So it's important people have a bit of buffer in their strategy when they buy a property.
Yeah, and I suppose, yes, when you have clients who come and see you, it's important to understand, yes, they're looking for income because they're a strong income, maybe not as much growth because they're trying to cover the loan, or they're retiring and so they want that income factor. They're not going to sell this property anytime soon, so it's all about the income. Or yes, you're looking for people who are saying, no, I'm, next 5-10 years, I want as much growth as possible because it's going to fund my deposit for my future home. So all of getting those sort of things right is so important. Probably touching on another topic when it comes to property that I find people often say to me is that, oh, well, I'll never invest in shares because that will go up and down and property will never go down. So, you should always invest in bricks and mortar. So I've heard that a lot. And while good quality property will over time go up, there are definitely people and some real horror stories of people buying off a plan or buying in areas they didn't really research where there's an oversupply and realize a year later it's worth $100,000 less.
Yeah, you're spot on, Mark. I mean, property moves in cycles like any other asset class. And, the cycle for a lot of people have experienced, particularly now with interest rates where they're at and whatnot, is obviously in a growth cycle across many markets across the country. But, there are certainly stories of people who've lost money on property or bought at the wrong end of the cycle or bought the wrong type of property. One of the ways that we like to buffer or try and avoid those types of situations, because look, the property is an open market, it's subject to market forces. Obviously it can go down, but what we find is that the markets that have limited supply and high demand, and these are typically the markets, as I said before, that have a lot of local buyers, what we call owner occupiers, they don't tend to suffer the downswings as greatly as markets that have got a lot of supply coming on, where predominantly they've been sold to investors. And some of these investors could be interstate, some of these investors could be overseas. And we see this a lot in some areas where there's a lot of apartments that go up, or a lot of what we call house and land, so new zoning for big land estates. We don't quite get the price pressure, and you've got potentially endless amounts of supply that can come on. And so when a market does hit a downturn, we can see some of these markets get hit significantly. The areas that could be nearby, could be hit minimally, because ultimately the local buyers who've got their kids at schools and things, they just sit tight. But the areas where you've got a lot of investors and people who may decide that holding that investment property is just no longer a priority, all of a sudden you've got a lot more supply hitting the market, and you don't have a natural pool of buyers from the local community. So those are the areas where you could see huge swings in values. And that's really sort of, it goes back to one of your earlier points. It's just about understanding those local markets, going back to your location point, in that it's really important you buy into the market with lots of local owner occupiers, because those markets tend to hold up a lot stronger in the downward sort of periods, whereas the areas where there's a lot of investors, they tend to get hit pretty hard. And that's what our research has found over the years.
So okay, so let's go into that a bit deeper. So that makes perfect sense to me, that if you're wanting to buy into an area where there's a lot of owner occupiers, so people are going to live there, this is their lifestyle, they're going to live there, work in the area, compared to people in oversupplied block of units, and they're just looking at this from an investment. So it's not, you're saying a property can't still be an owner occupier in a block of units. Your point, David, about owner occupiers is a really good one. So I wouldn't mind going a bit deeper into that. So it's not about whether it's a home or houses compared to apartments or units. It's about whether the majority of that area or that block of units is owner occupied, people who live in the area, compared to people who are buying as an investment, which then could there be an oversupply. So do you want to explain about that a bit more, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, it's really key. I mean, you can get an oversupply in any property type, be it an apartment, townhouse, or house. But you typically find the areas that have a lot of supply hitting the market, traditionally newer products. So, maybe take an example of a new apartments. They may have several thousand. The area might be zoned for several thousand apartments. It's not uncommon to see in some locations a lot of those apartments being sold to either interstate or overseas buyers. And then, when a market does hit a downturn, you just don't have the natural buyer pool to purchase those apartments. Conversely, you might have an apartment block that I'm aware of, lots of examples, but where there might be, say, 30 apartments, and you might have only 4 or 5 investors. The rest are all purchased through the local market. But also it could be in an area where that might be the first new project that's been delivered in the last 10 years, and it's a very tightly held market with a lot of owner occupiers. So, and it might be, for instance, near a beach where supply is very tight but demand is very high. So yeah, it is really about understanding who are the local buyers, how active are they, and what is the future supply of that type of say apartment in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And if you're in a market that's established and has a very tight planning code and has no real ability to bring on lots of extra supply, then you're pretty secure that you're buying with the local owner occupier pool. Then you'd be pretty secure that you're buying an investment that's attractive to owner occupiers. Conversely, if you're buying in an area that's got zoned for 5 to 10,000 apartments, that has a lot of it doesn't have the local demand, then there is always a risk that you might suffer a downturn when the market softens.
Yeah, no, that's really good point. And I suppose, okay, yes, you can go see experts like yourself to help you, guide you on these sort of knowing the area that you're buying into. But I suppose also, if you know somewhere in another state or another area, you can go to a local real estate agent, I presume, and ask whether that block has owner occupiers or mainly for investment. How easy is that to get that type of information?
Yeah, I mean, I think local real estate agents are a great resource. Part of our research process about being on the ground is to actually interview lots of real estate agents, not only sales agents, but property managers as well, just to understand how strong the local sales market is, how many, what's the days on market it's taking to sell the average property in the area, how quickly are things renting, how many applications per property, properties receiving when they're coming up for tenancy. No, they're a fantastic source. And look, most agents are pretty happy to talk to people, particularly if they think you're a prospective buyer. So I think that's a fantastic place. Obviously, what we do is understanding things like market cycle. which is a little bit harder to work out. So when is that particular market likely to go through its growth cycle? I mean, one thing that we find investors don't always fully appreciate is that the Australian property market doesn't move as one. So whilst Sydney might be going through a boom phase, Brisbane or another part of the country might be quite stagnant. So every market typically has a cycle, and that's really one of the key things that Binnari, as a research sort of firm, are able to help clients sort of access that information and pick a cycle that's more likely to be in a growth phase. But I certainly think if you're confident around the market cycle and you just want to get a feel for where that particular market is at, I think reaching out to local real estate agents, both the sales representatives and property managers, is a fantastic way to gather a quick insight into the local market.
Brilliant, thanks for that. And you're talking about cycles, and we know in Sydney, for example, which I know fairly well, and so the eastern suburbs is basically all of Sydney is going through a boom, but people from eastern suburbs are selling up and buying something, downsizing to the northern beaches or the lower North Shore are selling up and maybe buying Newcastle or Central Coast or down Jervis Bay. Where's the cycles for you? And you see this whole sea change, I know you say sea or tree change view at the moment in the trends.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Mark. Just watching, what's going on. You're definitely seeing people in sort of key areas like Sydney, say talking about eastern suburbs, or whether it be lower North Shore or inner west or wherever, we've got, some property houses. I mean, houses worth in $4, $5, $6 million that are just barely standard houses. And so people are kind of selling these houses and taking advantage of the fact that all that gain is typically tax-free because it's their home, and they're relocating to some of the other areas. Now, some people are going to places like, sort of southeast Queensland, where there's a lot of infrastructure and a lot of jobs being created and things like that. But other people are choosing to relocate to more rural areas, whether it be South Coast or Bowral or some of these places. So I think one of the sort of interesting things at play that we don't necessarily have an answer for yet. I mean, as a sort of research firm, we feel very comfortable in people that are making these changes or purchasing in areas for investment, such as, say, Sunshine Coast, because not only are they getting people relocating out of sort of Sydney and Melbourne for a tree change or a sea change, they've also got a natural migration of people moving there because the job markets are fairly strong, and it's just the natural cycle taking place. So COVID, if anything, has sort of turbocharged that those markets. But where it becomes interesting is looking at, say, areas like maybe, say, Bowral or the South Coast that traditionally haven't had as much employment and are fantastic areas to live. And because of the flexibility of COVID and the adoption of technology, people feel that they can maybe make these changes and still work. And so what we don't know yet is how sustainable that is in the long term when people maybe return to work. And so there's a little bit of unknown there as to whether there'll be people will kind of stop the migration to some of these areas when they may be required to work in the office a bit more. So we're just unsure about some of those locations, but certainly at the moment, there's been some really strong growth in some of those rural areas. There's just some unknown as to how that will play out in the next sort of 5 to 10 years.
And you did say before about that property markets in Australia don't all go up at the same time. So we're seeing sort of Sydney seems to have slowed down. So I wouldn't mind getting your view on that, because the last 9 months has been crazy with the prices in Sydney. But now seeing areas where Newcastle was booming for a while, but that seems to have plateaued, and now southeast Queensland. So do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, look, the markets all have their own independent, if you like, cycles. And, you can even have independent cycles within those markets. So parts of Sydney or particular property types can be behaving differently even within the same suburb. But certainly Sydney has been on a really strong run, probably from about 2011. There's been periods of little dips, but if you chart the median house price movement, it's been pretty consistent from around 2011. But in the previous to that, probably the previous 6-7 years, it was fairly stagnant. So, and the market that was the strongest was Southeast Queensland, really one of the strongest markets. So, yeah, I mean, where we see the longer term opportunity, when I say that, is Sydney may have a little bit of growth left in it, but we don't think it's sustainable at the current levels, just based on the fact that until we get some significant wage growth, people's borrowing capacities are unlikely to be able to afford to continue to pay more for houses. So generally, just by default, we'll probably enter a period of stagnation. We don't necessarily see that those markets crashing, but there's probably likely to enter some period of stagnation because people won't be able to borrow any more money. But if you look at an area, for instance, like say Brisbane, where you've got the average wage is similar to Sydney's, there's not a huge gap there at the moment. People are relocating to areas like that, securing quality jobs, and they're able to purchase properties for almost half price. Now, that won't last, because the more people that do that, the more pressure that's put on those local markets, and then they enter a cycle of growth. And we've already started to see that happen. We've started to see that happen already in areas like Sunshine Coast, where people have been relocating from Sydney and Melbourne, whether they be retirees or just relocating or purchasing second homes. We've started to see the pressure put on those types of markets, and they've experienced some significant growth over the last 18 months. But yeah, so certainly those markets outside of the key cities are experiencing growth, and we're even seeing, Sydney, Newcastle typically runs off the back of Sydney, but we're seeing even still those markets be impacted with people moving out of Sydney who are, effectively sort of selling their Sydney property, going there, buying a much more affordable place, but then utilising some of those proceeds to fund their retirement. So yeah, it's an interesting market at the moment, but certainly COVID is bringing forward some of the movements in these markets. But an area like Brisbane, which was, has been stagnant for probably the last sort of 7 to 8 years, has seen moderate growth, is just about, we feel is just about to enter a significant growth phase, largely due to the sort of, the cycles, but also that interstate migration that's starting to take place.
That's a great tip, and we'll follow that with interest. It's one of the things that I always say that, I've known people and they only will buy bricks and mortar, and I know people who only buy shares through their super fund or however they do it. And I just believe diversification is just so important. So yes, it's good to have shares, good to have your super, good to have a property, and because it all at the end of the day is providing, as long as it's good, providing good value, good growth, and providing you an ongoing income stream, it's definitely part of a good, sound investment portfolio. Well, Dave, thanks for that. That's been really valuable, and hopefully a lot of the people listening has gained some insight on property and the movements and some of the some tips and help that David's been able to provide. For our final bite of the money sandwich, we ask this question of all our guests: and what's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Yeah, Mark, I'm not sure if it's necessarily a piece of advice, but it's probably a learning. When I was younger, I lived with my grandparents for a couple of years, and as a lot of grandparents do, you tend to hear the same stories over and over. I can remember my grandfather specifically telling me that he paid his home off, many years before he actually retired, and that he just regretted not sort of being proactive in getting an investment strategy, and potentially, maybe borrowing some extra money and purchasing investment property, or investing further into shares, or just being a little bit more proactive with his investment strategy. So one of the things I've kind of learned and try to adopt in my own life, and certainly advising others, is just to have an investment strategy and be proactive. Because if you're not proactive and you're not in the game of investing, whether that's shares, property, whatever, it's very, very hard for you to put yourself in a really strong place at retirement. So I think it's probably a learning from other people's mistakes as opposed to advice, but that's probably what I took out of that.
Yeah, there are people who have reached their end and realize they have regrets, and that's life. But good quality, sound investment strategy and getting your money working harder for you is, I think that's perfect. Thanks, David. So I appreciate your time, and
No, thank you, Mark.
and look forward to talking again soon, David.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me.
you would like to know more about Binnari Property or you have a question for David and his team, visit his website, binnari.com.au. So that's Binnari, BINNARI.com.au. Thanks again for listening. And if you want to contact me or have a question, feel free to either email me on admin@themoneysandwich.com or visit my website, themoneysandwich.com. Enjoyed this episode and want to hear more of A Bite from the Money Sandwich? Make sure you subscribe on your platform of choice so you automatically receive each episode as soon as it is released. See you next time when we take another bite from the Money Sandwich.